In 1600s, something changed. Something so drastic that would shape the entire world to this day. The balance of power shifted to the West. The Mediterranean and Asian civilizations that ruled the world for thousands of years were in for a rude awakening. By 1914, colonial powers directly ruled the majority of the world. Even very small European countries like Belgium could rule over colonies across the globe with tens of millions of people. But then the question rises, why did the nations of Asia and Africa simply not modernize throughout all these years? Why did the modernization attempts almost always failed? Let's dive into it. Historians call the disparity that emerged after 17th century between Europe and the rest of the world the Great Divergence. Now obviously some nations did not stand a chance at overcoming the Great Divergence. Native Americans or Sub-Saharan Africans were technologically and economically so much behind that they simply could not compete. But what's interesting is that Asia had great and modern empires of its own. In 16th century, the Ottoman, Persian, Indian, and Chinese empires were just as powerful and advanced as the European ones. Within just 2 centuries, Europe had a clear advantage. This brings the question, were these people stupid? Why didn't the Ottomans or the Chinese just modernize? Let's start with the most obvious factor. To solve a problem, you need to know that there is a problem. Now I said that Europe was ahead of Asia by 18th century, but we know this in hindsight. People, especially the peoples of the East, did not understand it. East Asia was almost completely isolated and had very limited contact with the West until the Opium Wars. West Asia, namely the Ottomans and Persians, were much more interconnected with the Western world. However, even then, they were making their old systems work well enough until the 1700s, so they saw no reason to change. But that wasn't all. Even when these civilizations understood that they were behind, they did not really understand why. Here's the problem. The only symptom of their backwardness was their military defeats. Ottoman, Chinese, and Persian armies were repeatedly humiliated by Western armies in 19th century. So what these Eastern peoples saw was Westerners with their better guns, better ships, and bigger cannons defeating their armies. Naturally, they assumed that the problem was that their military, their training, their tactics, and their weaponry were not good enough. This is why a huge chunk of early modernization attempts were only limited to the military. They brought in European officers to train their troops and bought European weaponry. In fact, Ottomans had French advisors overseeing their military reforms as early as 18th century. But at the end of the day, it never mattered. Ottoman army equipped with superior weapons was destroyed in 1877 by the Russians just the same. Same thing happened with the Beiyang fleet, which was larger and as modernized as the Imperial Japanese Navy, but was humiliated in the Battle of Yalu River. The Western Europeans weren't dominating the world thanks to their superior weapons. They were dominating the world because their economic output was so much larger than the rest of the world. And when it came to war, European empires could produce more guns, afford to pay more soldiers, and supply these soldiers thousands of kilometers away from home. Meanwhile, the Ottomans or the Chinese would just hand out their shiny weapons that they couldn't replace to soldiers they couldn't afford, train, or feed. They simply lacked the industrial output to wage increasingly industrial wars. The failure to identify the real problem, which was the lack of industrialization, caused the Eastern powers to waste a lot of time. Even the Ottomans did not engage in meaningful industrialization efforts until late 19th century, and for China, no meaningful industrialization would happen until Mao's rule. Another major problem with Eastern modernization efforts was that it had taken Europe some 300 to 400 years to develop the conditions and institutions that led to the Industrial Revolution. It was simply impossible to imitate in just a few decades. Starting from 15th century, Europe greatly surpassed the rest of the world in terms of literacy, urbanization, and wages. You needed a literate workforce to sustain an industrial economy, and then you needed high urbanization so the factories could find workers, which was also lacking in the East. Just as importantly, you needed either access to massive amounts of cash or a capitalist class to finance the industrialization efforts. The Eastern societies lacked a powerful and rich bourgeoisie class, and their outdated governments could not afford the industrialization attempts. While European states had gotten more and more centralized, the Eastern empires had either stayed where they were or even regressed. Eastern imperial governments simply lacked the control over their empires to oversee widespread social changes. And this was all topped by reactionary movements. In hindsight, when we read about rebellions against modernization efforts, we think them as stupid. But what these people were experiencing was practically 200 to 300 years worth of change in their way of life, shoved down their throats in just a few decades. Suddenly, their government was pushing for international trade, urban life, and factories. Meanwhile, these people were just content to live and die the way their ancestors had lived and died. Widespread social change cannot naturally happen in a few decades. It needs to be forced, and forced reforms naturally result in counter-reaction. And in some cases, reactionary figures like Sultan Abdülhamid II of the Ottomans ruled for a long time, stalling and even reversing the reforms that were made. And the final obstacle I will mention to modernization was external factors, mainly the colonial European powers. The Eastern empires did not exist in a vacuum, and they certainly were not left alone. Their modernization efforts were constantly hampered by European invasions, interventions, and unfair economic treaties. Not only the Europeans were more efficient at producing goods, but they also got unfair advantages against their Eastern competition. For example, in the Ottoman Empire, British goods were taxed less than the local goods, which allowed them to turn profit at lower prices. The unfair conditions drove Ottoman manufacturers out of business and even caused deindustrialization. In China, the same thing happened after the Opium Wars. Meanwhile, Persia was completely dismantled as a functioning state by Russia in 19th century. Overall, modernization efforts in 19th century largely failed due to a lack of understanding by the Asian empires, lack of socioeconomic factors to support the reforms, and internal and external opposition. Thank you for watching, hope you liked it, and I will see you in the next one.